Big stories. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken visits Manila for the second time under President Bongbong Marcos and reaffirms Washington's ironclad commitment to the Philippines.
Hong Kong passes a sweeping new national security law that cracks down further on criticism and dissent, and which analysts say aligns the city further with mainland China.
And Senate President Big Zubiri has signed the arrest order against Apollo Quiboloy due to his refusal to appear before the Senate inquiry into his church's alleged abuses.
Good evening. Welcome to the show. I'm Regina.
I'm Gretchen.
And I'm Shawn.
U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has called on China once again to stop bullying the Philippines in the disputed West Philippine Sea, citing the U.S.'s ironclad defense commitment to the Philippines. He said this earlier today, right here in Manila, in fact.
Well, Blinken is currently in the Philippines for an official visit, and he paid a courtesy call to President Marcos today. Also held a bilateral meeting with his Filipino counterpart, Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo.
This marks Blinken's second visit to the Philippines, and it was described to us last night by International Studies Professor Renato de Castro as a prelude to the Trilateral Leaders Summit between U.S., Japan, and the Philippines, to be held in Washington next month. To give us more details on Blinken's visit today, let's bring in Camille Samonte. What do you have for us, Camille?
Shawn, as expected, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's agenda centered on talks on defense and security cooperation between the United States and the Philippines. His first stop was a meeting with Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo at the DFA office in Pasay. Number one topic in their talks is the rising tensions in the West Philippine Sea. Here, Manalo reiterated the Philippines' claim in the disputed territory.
That the Philippines is committed to managing disputes in accordance with our national interests, a rules-based international order, and international law, especially UNCLOS.
Blinken, meanwhile, warned China against their increasing aggressiveness in the South China Sea. He said the U.S. will not stand idly by while China continues its aggressive actions.
We have a shared concern about the PRC's actions that threaten our common vision for a free, open Indo-Pacific, including in the South China Sea and in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. They're also critical to the interests of the region, the United States, and the world. It's why we stand with the Philippines and stand by our ironclad defense commitments.
Blinken also reminded China of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines.
Article 4 of that treaty extends to any armed attacks on Filipino armed forces, on public vessels, on aircraft, and that would include its Coast Guard. And that would also be anywhere in the South China Sea. So we've been very clear about that, very consistent about that.
As expected, Beijing reacted negatively to this. They note that the U.S. is not a party to the South China Sea issue and that they have no right to interfere in maritime issues between the Philippines and China. This afternoon, Blinken also paid a courtesy visit on President Marcos in Malacanang. There, Marcos and Blinken discussed the possible expansion of U.S. military presence in the Philippines.
I hope that all these efforts you're making are met with some success, because it is of great importance to us, as you well know, as you have said, as we have spoken about before. These things are somehow toned down. I can't see how they're going to do it. I think that some easing of tensions on these we will see in the near future.
Mostly, and I think the Foreign Secretary said so well, our relationship between the Philippines and the United States is in hyperdrive. That was the word that you used, and that's so true. We see it across every domain. It's something that we attach great importance to.
Ladies, we are expecting more talks between the U.S. and the Philippines in the upcoming trilateral leaders summit between the Philippines, Japan, and U.S. set to be held in Washington next month. The White House confirmed that the meeting on April 11 will be attended by President Marcos and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and U.S. President Joe Biden. The leaders are expected to discuss matters concerning the economy, technology, clean energy, and climate change. They will also hold discussions on peace and security in the Indo-Pacific region. Ladies?
Thanks so much for that, Camille Samonte.
Well, in the past months, we've seen more and more top-level officials from the United States come visit the Philippines. In fact, Foreign Affairs Anthony Blinken said that the Philippine-U.S. relations are in hyperdrive. But
Secretary of State
Blinken,
yeah.
He did say that the reinvigorating and re-energizing of relationships is not targeted towards a third party or a third country, but this is in line with a shared vision, a common vision towards a free Indo-Pacific seas.
That's right. He clarified that the upcoming trilateral summit between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines is a new horizon of cooperation that is incredibly promising. And he confirmed that indeed, like you said, the three leaders are set to attend on April 11th.
I love the flowery statements. A new horizon of cooperation that is incredibly promising indeed. But one other thing that that Secretary Blinken was met with today was protests. Of course, always there's protests. Some groups that were against Blinken's visit held protests today, including Bayan Muna and Kilusang Mayo Uno. They said only the U.S. and Marcos will benefit from economic and defense partnerships between the U.S. and the Philippines.
That's right, Reg. They're also calling for the end of EDCA. The signs by the protesters or being held up by the protesters, in fact, read, "Blinken, you are not welcome. Blinken, go home."
Now, earlier in the day, Blinken also took time to visit a semiconductor manufacturing facility in Muntinlupa. He toured the Amcor technology plant, which is a semiconductor packaging and test services venture of American and Korean firms. Amcor employs around 10,000 Filipinos across the country. During the visit, Blinken said the CHIPS Act will bolster ties between the Filipino and American semiconductor industry. Now, CHIPS stands for Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors. And it's essentially a $500 million fund to help the U.S. invest further into the manufacturing capabilities of its partner countries.
There's a long-standing partnership between the United States and the Philippines when it comes to semiconductors. We continue to look for ways to strengthen even more the partnership between our countries. The CHIPS Act has a significant fund that the State Department is responsible for to make further investments in partner countries to build their capacity.
Both the Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo said that there's a lot of work cut out, even with the stronger alliance. And he did talk about, Anthony Blinken did talk about reducing dependencies, starting with the manufacturing capabilities. And President Marcos had previously announced that we will aim to produce 128,000 engineers in the semicon industry by 2028 with the support of the CHIPS Act. Now, the goal is to boost research and manufacturing to capitalize on the needs of high-tech industries. The CHIPS Act actually incentivizes manufacturing the chips in the U.S., but there are several segments in the process that could be cheaper to outsource, like assembly, testing, and packaging. Now, we know that the Philippines is one of the only 7 partner countries under the CHIPS Act.
And it's coming at, couldn't have come at a better time because there is a global arms race to build what they call high-value semiconductors, actually, what with the advent of AI. So countries like Taiwan. I shouldn't call it country, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So
places like Taiwan.
Jurisdictions like Taiwan and countries like Vietnam, for instance, are, ramping up their manufacturing facility in the semicon industry as well, hoping to get a slice of that pie because, these could really boost a country's GDP, right? Once you start producing higher value
Also,
chips.
onshore, as we know, Reg, one of our more high-valued exports are semiconductors. We've been pretty consistent in that sector. And in fact, the electronics sector actually comprises more than 60% of the Philippines' merchandise exports. So that's going to be a good deal, at least economically speaking.
No, I
Very
like how you put
jobs-wise.
it. It's an arms race.
It is. And imagine, look, President Marcos has already asked American companies to try or to look into building what they call wafer fabrication facilities. I don't know what that means. I looked it up. It's quite complicated, but
It's like
a
a new
wafer
kind of a
is
chip.
a part of the semiconductor. Basically, it's a one part of the process. Basically, so imagine if we could try to wrangle some of that CHIPS Act money and to try to build more facilities here.
Yeah.
The
Also-
jobs, the investments, right?
Yeah, I think my understanding of it is we are good in some segments of the entire production chain. So I think maybe with the CHIPS Act, if we do get funding, we can expand to, either backwards or forward integration along that chain. And speaking of arms races, this piece of news just broke this evening. Hong Kong has passed a sweeping new security law which grants authorities even more power to crack down on dissent. This new legislation was passed with extraordinary speed, being debated by the Legislative Council in just over 11 days. It is known as Article 23 and introduces 39 new national security crimes covering treason, insurrection, sabotage, external interference, and unlawful handling of state secrets, with the most serious offenses punishable by life imprisonment. Article 23 builds on the first national security law, which was imposed by Beijing and passed back in 2020, even after months of pro-democracy protests. Analysts say this law, which takes effect on March 23, could have a chilling effect on a wide range of people, including lawyers, civil servants, diplomats, academics, and of course, journalists. Amnesty International says it will, quote, stifle any and all criticism of the Chinese and Hong Kong authorities and their policies.
Okay, let's deep dive now into some of these goings on between the U.S., the Philippines, and China. We have with us on the show tonight geopolitical analyst Don Mclain. Gill, Don, it's been a minute. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. It's a true pleasure to join you guys again for this very important segment.
Lots to talk about just in our first block. Before we get to Blinken, I wanted to ask you about Hong Kong, which is the news that broke just tonight. Hong Kong passing a sweeping new security law, building on what they passed in 2020, which cracks down even further on dissent and has, which analysts have said could cause a chilling effect. What are the larger implications here, do you think? Is this the end of Hong Kong as we know it?
Well, the seeds of this particular Article 23 that you have just mentioned were already in place as early as 2020 with the national security law. And I think that from that time, it was quite evident that something like this could have eventually sprouted out, especially at a time when Beijing seeks to consolidate its national power based on the pursuance of its core interests. Now, of course, you're talking about the implications. Well, of course, when we look into the implications, the terminology of this particular document also highlights the problems that could be faced by civilians. The vagueness and the broadness of the terminology could be used, of course, to punish people for various crimes that may not be completely defined based on this Article 23. And of course, this would have repercussions of freedom of speech and all the other attributes that seek to preserve the rule of law in the country, in the area. And of course, this is something that is in line with Beijing's overarching goal of, as I've mentioned before, consolidating national power. And of course, the integration of such territories are of vital interest to Beijing.
Don, 21 years ago, this would have been marred by protests, even in 2015, 2019. What happened to Hong Kong? I mean, now we don't see a lot of protests out on the streets. What changed that allowed for this legislation to pass?
Right, Gretchen. We have to remember before and a little bit after the national security law, there were in fact a dozen, in the thousands and hundreds and thousands of protests that were erupting. But of course, it was dealt with force, and of course, this was not something that should be lightly taken. And of course, there's still that trauma from what took place a few years back, and of course, there are also concerns whether the safety of all these people that seek to, of course, demonstrate their rejection of such legislation. But of course, as I've mentioned, there is that psychological impact as well. And of course, this seems to be a lot more strict. And it's as an extension of the national security law. It is applied in a more rigid manner. So thus, the retribution could be more dangerous. In fact, that there have been statements of punishments leading up to life imprisonment, for example. And the vagueness of such terminology make it even more dangerous and more risky. So of course, the people have to make that balance as well, especially what happened a few years ago.
So basically, Don, it was everything, every bit, whatever those protesters were worried about, it's finally come to light with this Article 23.
Right. And I think that, as I mentioned, if you have been looking into what has been happening for the past few years, something of this sort, it was inevitable, especially since Beijing now seeks to maximize its power amidst, of course, domestic uncertainty. There have been also issues with the national economy. So, of course, this is also one way of gaining nationalist sentiment at home. Right, and as we all know, hyper-nationalism is the primary catalyst for the strengthening of local power at the seat of the CCP. So of course, if we all try to connect the dots, this is something that has been in store for quite some time now.
Maximizing power, it could be done internally, like what we have just seen and what we have talked about, but it can also be done externally. For example, China, of course, in the South China Sea, posturing. Now that Secretary of State Blinken is here in the Philippines for the second time under Marcos, more posturing. What do you make of what's happening today, and were you happy with how the meeting between Blinken and his statement came out after the meeting with the president?
Right. So if you look into the visit by Secretary Blinken, there are three major objectives that were shown here, right? First is that while there are concerns in the region about the looming elections in the U.S. and the turbulence, the geopolitical turbulence taking place in other parts of the world, this visit emphasizes Washington's commitment in prioritizing its ties with key allies such as the Philippines amidst structural challenges brought by China's assertiveness, particularly in the West Philippine Sea. We have been seeing, of course, that reiteration of the ironclad commitment, right? Second, of course, since his visit was put into context from the, on the basis of the Trade Secretary's visit a few days back, this is also a representation of Washington's acknowledgement that its ties with the Philippines are multidimensional. So while defense is a major aspect, economics is now seen as an important component, which is naturally the heart of every developing nation's foreign policy. And third, of course, is there's that necessity to institutionalize the alliance along with new forms of cooperative frameworks. So we have, of course, the upcoming US-Japan Philippine trilateral, and the institutionalism of this particular aspect makes it more sustainable in the long term, making it less prone to inconsistencies. And we have talked about this during my time here with you in the past few months. So I think that things are going up to plan.
The rising tensions in the West Philippine Sea were brought up earlier in the press conference. The Secretary of State was asked about these gray zone tactics, and what would the response be if it would actually, or what would trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that the Philippines is continuing to do a good job on it. Are you happy with the answers with regard to that, with regard to operationalizing the Article 4 of the MDT?
Right. Well, we have to understand, I know that this has been a controversy, especially lately, as what consists of an armed attack, right? And I think that that is a legitimate question to be asked, but we have to understand that defining it is equally difficult for both Manila and Washington, especially at a time when Beijing is willing to exploit inconsistencies in the U.S. alliance. So I think there has to be that sort of understanding first, is that, by defining it, would there be contingencies in case that Beijing's actions fall into some particular definition? And if if not enough action has been, operationalized, how would that impact the alliance, right? So that's one thing. A second, of course, is the idea that the U.S. and other like-minded partners must engage with the Philippines in a way that would also boost its capabilities of deterrence and, of course, intelligence sharing and the ability to see through these gray zone strategies. And I think that the Philippines and its transparency initiative have in fact stripped China of any sort of legitimacy that it seeks to promote based on its global security initiative of being the leader of Asia, of an Asian for Asian. So that's one important point. But I still feel that Beijing is still watching. Given the changing nature of democratic electoral systems, Beijing is currently watching and waiting to see if there are more chances of exploitation. So this is, I think, one of the most important prerequisites for the U.S. and the Philippines and other partners, of course, to consolidate efforts to address such gray zone abilities, given that the work has just begun. And China, given the state of its domestic system, would be more aggressive, likely, to consolidate nationalism. And we can see that what's happening in Hong Kong. So we have to be more cautious of what is to come in the next few years.
But that's exactly it, right? On the one hand, you have China flexing its muscles, consolidating power, i.e. Hong Kong. And then you've got the U.S. as well, at the same time, embracing Southeast Asia, making a lot of overtures. In the middle is a very small power, which is the Philippines. Do you ever worry that we may have, in terms of foreign affairs, that we may have hewed too close to Washington in this instance and not made enough of an outreach to Beijing?
Well, for one thing, I commend our Department of Foreign Affairs, of course, for having a proactive position on this. What is our position? We have to understand it's not as simple as being pro-China, pro-U.S. and anti-China. What are we doing? We are, first of all, engaging with our partners and our ally for the purpose of securing our sovereignty and sovereign rights, improving our maritime security capabilities and deterrence, and of course, keeping the West Philippine Sea open and free and secured and rules-based, right? But on the other hand, we are also working into our national legislation, such as the passing of the Maritime Zones Act, and of course, the upcoming Comprehensive Archipelagic Doctrine, right? So these are, of course, complementary ways to leverage our growing defense connectedness for the purpose of our security and our sovereign rights, but at the same time, complementing it with our own ability to govern the seas. And third, of course, is important that we keep diplomatic channels open with China. We have been very consistent since the beginning, and I've mentioned this time and again, at the beginning of the Marcos Jr. administration started with an outreach in that willingness to negotiate proper terms with China, but it was China who gave us the cold shoulder, but that's something that we recognize, and we are still very much open to negotiations. And I think Secretary Manalo has wonderfully stated that we will seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict based on international law, and that is through peaceful negotiation. So while keeping the door open, we have to do our part in securing what is rightfully ours based on international law. And as you've mentioned, given the limited resources that we have to turn to like-minded and trusted partners. And I don't think that, and I think that we are doing the right thing in this regard, right? So our purpose here is not to engage in bloc politics, but to leverage our existing partnerships for our security, while at the same time complementing the interests of our partners as well. So I think that this is a very tricky situation, and despite that, I think we're doing a pretty good job.
Right, but I wonder how far can we poke the bear without them, roaring back or scratching us back. How many defense cooperations can we seal? How many more treaties can we bring up with how many more allies until we can expect some harder reactions from China?
Okay.
Go ahead.
And before you answer that, Dawn, I smile because just as Shawn was saying that, there was a headline from Bloomberg that just dropped. They had an exclusive with President Marcos today, and the headline goes, as tensions rise in the South China Sea, President Marcos will not start a conflict with China, will not be poking the bear. exactly the phrase that Shawn
Exactly,
used. And
exactly. Yeah.
if okay, so again, that was a Bloomberg exclusive. We will not be poking the bear. Where does that leave us in terms of strategy if we won't push the envelope too far?
I mean, we've never sought to poke the bear per se. I mean, what we are doing is basically acting within our jurisdiction, but it's actually the bear that is trying to poke us. And in this regard, of course, we are still acting with civility. We have always maintained the moral high ground, but at the same time, we have pursued our interests based on pragmatic operations. But the thing is, China has been showing discontent time and time and again, and we have seen this through upping its scale in the West Philippine Sea, the atrocities that it has been committing. But at the same time, China knows that, it cannot go all out. Because first of all, as a rational actor, it knows its military limitations. And I think that it has learned enough from what is happening in Eastern Europe. Russia has a completely, quite a difficult time in pursuing its goals, despite the fact that it was just crossing the border. But here you have to go through the tumultuous maritime domain, where, of course, there are other actors involved as well. So I think that it is well aware of its limitations. What it's just doing now is trying to test how far it could go. And of course, while waiting for any changes in the political spectrum. So I think, again, this is the point in time where we must remain committed. And I think our Coast Guard, our military have been on point in showing that level of dedication. So I think that it's not going to be easier for us. It's just think that what we're doing now would make it easier for us. No, but it's all about consistency in foreign affairs. It's all about consistency in international politics. And we would be, pursuing that path based on consistency. So I think that while the challenges are growing, we are trying to maneuver in whatever little room we have left. And I think that, as far as our foreign policy is concerned, we're trying to do that exactly.
Don, what are you looking out for in the upcoming trilateral summit with the U.S. and Japan?
Well, I first of all hope that this would be an annual thing, and because it's very, as I mentioned before, it's very important to institutionalize foreign cooperative frameworks to make sure that it sustains even with a change of presidents. Now, if you remember the Balikatan, for example, even though we had, sort of a patchy relationship with Washington during the previous administration, we still pursued our cooperation in the Balikatan to the point that it was the largest at that point. So such institutionalized forms of cooperation go a long way in ensuring consistency. Now, second, of course, is that we have to focus on building each other's capabilities and providing, more logistical, a more comprehensive logistical framework for the three of our nations to actually better operationalize their partnership in the maritime domain, given, of course, Japan is facing significant problems in the East China Sea, so are we in the West Philippine Sea. So I think that this should be an area that needs to be looked at. And of course, there needs to be ways in which we could link hard defense and hard security with economic cooperation as well. And I think that Japan, through its OSA and through its ODA, has shown its willingness to do both. And I think that we have to also play our part in order to fit in this particular picture.
Certainly, lots for the diplomats to think about and chew on. Thanks for all your insights once again. That was geopolitical analyst Don Mclain Gill joining us tonight.
Well, up next, after weeks of being snubbed, the Senate has officially ordered the arrest of Pastor Apollo Quiboloy. The details when we return. Keep it here on One News. Welcome back. You're still watching the big story here on One News. So ito na nga.
Ito na.
Meron na.
Nagyari na.
Meron na tayong update. The Senate has officially released an arrest order against Kingdom of Jesus Christ leader Apollo Quiboloy. The arrest order was issued today by the Senate Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality. It was signed by Senator Risa Hontiveros, the committee's chairperson, and Senate President Mig Zubiri. This means that the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms is tasked with arresting and detaining Quiboloy. This comes after Quiboloy's repeated failure to appear in hearings that were looking into allegations of abuse in his church. At the moment, the Senate is unsure of Quiboloy's whereabouts, but Zubiri says that they will be fair to him.
Once maaresto sila, kapag schedule na kami sa wakas ng hearing na dadalo siya para sa wakas humarap sa komite, pakinggan ang aming mga tanong at sagutin ang mga ito.
We tried our best, even back channeling, to ask Pastor Quiboloy to attend the best possible way, pero ayaw talaga niya pumunta dito. So we have no other choice but to issue the warrant of arrest. Comply lang po sila, pumunta siya dito. We'll ensure him that it will be fair, that his rights will be respected.
Adding to his problems, Quiboloy has been charged with human trafficking at the Pasig City Court. That's according to the Department of Justice. That is a non-bailable offense. Now, the Pasig Court has to determine whether there's just cause to issue an arrest warrant. If they do, and Quiboloy evades that warrant, he will be declared a fugitive. The DOJ also said a separate case of child abuse was filed at a Davao City court last week.
Now, speaking of crimes and criminality, President Marcos has called on the PNP to step up its efforts to fight it. Marcos made the statement during the oath-taking ceremony of star-ranked PNP officers in Malacanang. In his speech, Marcos lauded the drop in index crimes under his administration. Index crimes are serious crimes that include murder, theft, and rape. From over 100,000 recorded in 2017, the number of index crimes in 2023 went down to 38,000. Still, Marcos says the National Police should not be complacent and content, noting that, quote, one crime is one too many for the nation.
We have done it without resorting to legal shortcuts or short-circuiting the process or acts that subvert the rule of law. We should not be content with the current decrease in crime rates. Even in their diminished state, the disturbance they cause is still immeasurable.
So it's not just index crime. President Marcos also told the PNP to focus on efforts in combating cybercrime, which is...
Oh, we can vouch for that.
Yeah,
I mean, what with all the many times we had to report on hacking incidents, phishing incidents, scamming incidents, a lot.
Right. He also said, that innovation and technology are important in order to protect Filipinos from cyber threats. We already know that. But the president also added that cyber crimes are not just a threat to citizens, but also to national security. Like you said, of late, it has been government
Just last
websites.
week, we were reporting how the website of the House of Representatives had to fend off hundreds of millions of hacking attempts
within a short period of time.
Another news, quite disturbing. That's how Senator Risa Hontiveros described the decision of the Commission on Elections to award the 18 billion peso vote counting machines contract to South Korean firm Miru Systems amid its alleged questionable track record. In a privileged speech, Hontiveros questioned the lack of bidders for the automated election system contract for the 2025 national and local elections.
Miru was previously involved in supplying automated election systems for, aside from its home country, the Kyrgyz Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Republic of Iraq. In Congo, researchers reportedly found that the machines Miru tried to sell there were repackaged equipment originally intended for Argentina, where similar machines faced pushback. Ang tawag nga sa Congo na mga election machines doon ay cheating machines.
On March 11, Comelec and Miru signed the contract for the 2025 elections. The nearly 18 billion peso contract will cover around 110 8,000 machines and peripherals, including ballot boxes, laptops, and other printing requirements for the 2025 national elections. Hontiveros also raised the possibility of bid suppression among companies. This is where one or more competitors agree not to bid or withdraw previously submitted bids so that a designated bidder will win.
Napakalaking kontrata. Wala ni isang ibang bidder? Yes, Smartmatic was disqualified because of its own money laundering controversies, but there were others. Bakit biglang naglaho na lang?
We'll be pausing for a quick break for now, but right after that, Quezon City will soon mandate that all restaurants in the city disclose the calorie counts of their menu items. We will discuss that when we return. Stay with us here.
Welcome back. You're still watching The Big Story here on One News. Conscious about your calorie intake? I am. But if you're living in Quezon City, you may be getting a bit of help on that soon because QC is working on a policy requiring big and middle scale restaurants to display the number of calories on each of their menu items. This concept was presented during the Partnership for Healthy Cities Summit held recently in Cape Town, South Africa. This conference tackled nutrition, clean air, and road safety programs and was attended by more than 70 member cities, including Quezon City. One News anchor Jovi Francisco got to talk to city officials about this new initiative.
Mamimili ka ng pagkain mo, makikita mo, for example, burger, makikita mo kung ano yung calorie count ng burger na yun, as well as the fries, pati yung drinks.
So, nandun na siya talaga.
So, meron ka ng informed decision kung sa kakainin mo or yung food choices mo.
To eat healthy.
Alam mo, any bago, lahat tayo. Any pagbabago. Magrereklamo muna bago sumunod.
Yes,
COVID lang eh. Magreklamo muna bago sumunod. Pero you are giving them naman choices eh. Alam mo ang weight mo, alam mo anong kinakain mo. Oops, ganito pala kinakain ko. Oops, hindi ko yan bibilin. Oops, hahatiin ko lang to, hati tayo. Pero at least aware ka, oops, ang dami ko palang kinain ngayon. Bukas maglalakad ako ng ganito kahaba.
Yeah.
Helping the Quezon City government get this initiative off the ground is public interest law group Imagine Law. And we have with us tonight their project manager and resident nutritionist, Jeline Corpus. Magandang gabi po.
Magandang gabi. Maraming salamat sa pag-imbita sa amin dito sa The Big Story.
Jeline, alam naman natin, no, pagdating sa calorie count, akala mo kumbaga parang maliit na bagay lang yan. Pero this is quite a drastic measure because usually pagka medyo yung pagkain ay mumura, medyo mataas ang calories yan eh. Alam natin, I did the food business before. But what exactly made the city turn in this direction to actually require calorie counts in the menus?
Yeah, so with that, thank you for that question. No? So before the calorie labeling in Quezon City, so kami sa Imagine Law, we've been working in Quezon City on healthy diet promotion initiatives such as the healthy public food procurement. So doon kami nagsimula. Itong calorie labeling is really part of the holistic approach of the city in creating healthy food environment and healthy diet promotion in the city. Because as we know, not only in Quezon City but in general in the Philippines, tumataas yung kaso ng mga non-communicable diseases such as the diabetes, hypertension, and also cancer. And related din dito yung pagkakaroon ng overweight and obesity. So that's why the city government really have the calorie labeling as part of their holistic approach in creating healthy food environment and healthy diet promotion.
Actually, I have been to countries where, kahit yung fast food, nakapaskil doon na parang 800 calories pala tong milkshake, 800 calories tong burger. Pero I just wanted to know, medyo blanket kasi siya. When you see everything that we put inside our mouth, meron namang calorie except yata ang tubig. Good calories, bad calories, how does this help people make the discernment? Kung ang kinakain ba nating calories, for example, yung white rice, brown rice, same amount. Mas mataas yung calories ng brown rice, but that's not necessarily bad. So how do we, apart from, blanket putting the numbers on, how do we make people or help them make a decision that these are good calories and this is like maybe not so great of a calorie?
Yeah, I think for the calorie labeling initiative, always part nito yung nutrition education. So there should be a campaign for what is calorie, understanding yung calorie and other nutrition information na makikita sa ating mga menu sa restaurants. Kasi bawat individual magkakaiba yung nutrient needs. But with this initiative, yung calorie labeling, it will help yung ating mga consumer to make informed decision, particularly on selecting the food they eat. So basically, lalo yung mga consumer natin na, they watch out what they eat because they are trying to maintain their weight, healthy weight, and also yung mga consumers natin na nagbabantay ng kanilang health condition, particularly yung may mga diabetes, may mga and hypertension. So kaakibat or kapartner talaga nitong ating calorie labeling would be nutrition education so that this consumer will really understand what is calorie and what are the good calorie that are appropriate for them because we as individual have different calorie needs and nutrient needs.
I assume you've had some consultations with the stakeholders about this. You're helping the QCLGU get this off the ground. What's been the feedback so far in terms of what the challenges are going to be in rolling this out to all the restaurants in the city?
Yeah, actually the city councilors or yung mga legislator ng Quezon City conducted public consultations for the ordinance. And we are really happy. I'm happy to share that the general public, during the public consultation, there is a positive feedback from them because they also want to be part of the solution, in addressing the non-communicable diseases and the overweight and obesity problems here in the country. So we understand that there might be some challenges, but the Quezon City government is really open in, providing technical assistance to the food businesses.
Jeline, kasama ba out of curiosity, kasama ba dyan street food, karinderya, lahat?
Yun yung nakikita natin ngayon eh.
Oo nga eh.
Yeah, actually, sa best practices talaga ang calorie labeling, not only in Quezon City, but in as well as in other countries, particularly sa Europe and the US. Sa New York kasi meron, di ba? So these calorie labeling would be applicable to the standardized menu kasi kapag yung mga karinderya natin, small businesses, may medyo challenge yun kasi pabago-bago yung kanilang menu. and yung calorie content would be different. So these calorie labeling in best practices in other countries are really applicable only to standardized menu. You know, yung mga kahit saan ka kumain na branch, parehas yung pagkain. Parehas yung lasa,
So
parehas
big
yung size.
chains.
So,
Big chain
yes, yung
restaurants.
Jolene, how did business owners react to this? Were they receptive? Kasi yun na nga, no? Parang, syempre, pag nakita mo yung milkshake, baka ma-turn off yung mga tao kasi malaking calories. Bababa yung benta ko dito. Mamaya, nagbebenta ako ng dessert na sobrang, yun lang naman ang aking hinahain. Alam mo naman mga Pinoy, mahilig sa matamis, maraming calories yun. Anong reaksyon ng mga negosyante?
Yeah, actually, natuwa kami nung public consultation. Hindi ko alam kung pwede akong magbanggit ng brand, no, but there is a food chain that is already doing their calorie labeling. And also there is one small business in Maginhawa. They are also doing the calorie labeling. So basically, the food businesses are also, supportive dito sa initiative ng Quezon City. I think personally, I think this also will help them in promotion their products as healthy options.
Di ba mas madali, Jeline, if you just work with the food chains? I mean, nasa kabubuti naman nila yon na i-disclose rin kung ano yung calories, it's definitely good for PR. Wouldn't that be better to just roll out, example, itong malaking chain na may 1,000 branches, di ba mas madali na sila nilang kausapin natin kaysa LGU ang magmamandate? In terms of impact.
Yeah, well, actually, that's one way, to approach yung calorie labeling natin. So yung mga food businesses natin, like yung mga pre-packaged food, meron na talaga silang calorie labeling or nutrition information in their food products. But with the restaurants, food chains, wala pa. But yung importance kasi ng policy, it institutionalize kung ano yung dapat practices na mayroon sa mga local government units or sa cities. Kasi without the policy, wala tayong magiging enforcement. Of course, yung monitoring ng compliance din sa mga ganitong initiative. That's why yung pagkakaroon ng ordinance or ng policy in a city or perhaps in the national level is really important to institutionalize and ensure that the initiative is effectively implemented.
Baka dapat magkaroon ng Anti-Discrimination Act din dito kasi kung wari pinili mo yung maraming calories.
Pwede kang i-judge.
Pwede kang i-judge na mga kasama mo. Kain tayo sa QC?
Kain tayo sa QC?
You should find
Sige, sa ano na lang, sa iba na
to eat with, right? But one last thing, Jolene, I was wondering if you already know, of course, the ordinance is still being worked out by QC, but you said that there won't be monitoring. So how do we know that the data is accurate, right? Who's going to be deciding that? Who's to say? Because you mean calories need an absolute number. Sometimes it's just a range, right? These nutrition information labels. So how do we ensure the integrity of the data?
Yeah, I believe the Quezon City government will conduct a press conference once the ordinance is passed and signed. But basically, I will answer that as a nutritionist dietitian. No, so because we are part of the consultation process and part of the work for this calorie labeling. So with the computation or estimation ng calorie and other nutrient content ng mga food items na ino-offer ng mga restaurants, there are ways. So one way is yung pag-laboratory test ng ating mga pagkain. And then another way is yung pag-calculate ng mga registered nutritionist dietitian. And there is also a tool by the Food and Nutrition Research Institute that the nutritionist dietitian can use in estimating the nutrient content, including the calorie content of the food that the food businesses are offering.
Jolene, timelines. What's your target rollout for this?
Yeah, soonest. I think the city government is really excited, to have the ordinance passed already. So soonest, hopefully, I cannot really give the actual date, but as soon as possible, mapapasa na itong ordinance. And definitely, we will again reach out to you to invite you for the press conference.
Okay, I guess this is only the start and we'll have to be talking about it once, the paper is actually out.
Invite ko kayo sa QC, ah.
Tas kain tayo,
Kain tayo.
Okay.
Sa karinderya
I'll
para
pass.
wala.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Imagine Law Project Manager and Resident Nutritionist, Jeline Corpus.
Okay, ito na. Isang mainit na balita na 1 week na natin pinag-uusapan. It's not just Bohol that is apparently dealing with business establishments being built within protected areas. Our big pictures tonight are these resorts reportedly situated within the Mount Apo National Reserve in Digos, Davao del Sur. Senator Raffy Tulfo expressed concern over these structures in a privileged speech. He says the resorts should not have been given clearance in the first place. A quick look into Google Earth shows other resorts and villas within the vicinity of Mount Apo, and it's not clear just how many of them are considered illegal. Senator Tulfo said the Protected Area Management Board of Mount Apo has a 2-year action plan to phase out these illegal structures, although he's not quite sure why it needs to take that long.
This is all because of Ren the Adventurer.
Kaya
She
nga
went on
eh.
one trip.
I do think, though, the Mount Apo one, there was a fire recently. A few years ago,
20,
campers.
I think that was 2016.
Remember that?
2016, 2015.
Tagal na pala.
2016. I went there after.
Yeah, so
to check on how the mountain was doing when it opened after the fire.
after the fire. So imagine one careless hiker, one careless camper can
And that's,
cause this.
therefore, the
Although-
point being, that's why we shouldn't have these resorts within
The
protected
debate
areas.
here is that kailangan din naman ng kabuhayan ng mga taong nakatira doon, VIPs. So
that's
that's
the other
why
side of
they
it.
allow multiple use zones. The question is, to what extent will they allow these infrastructure and structures to be constructed? So kumbaga parang anong papayagan mo within the bounds of law?
Which
Kawawa rin
is
naman
the
yung
debate
indigenous-
over the Bohol
Yes.
resort na rin, right? We keep coming back to the 20%, but no one seems to have the definitive answer on what does that mean exactly? 20% base to tip, 20%.
Kaya
And who
nga,
has
so
the
how
power,
can you
right?
how can you blame them, 'di ba? If there's no clear guidelines on the 20% and if they got a permit, it's also not that easy to close it down. Ang daming mawawalan ng trabaho basta-basta na lang. I mean, it's also
And there's
unfair
legal implications then. Can you
There
just
are
shut down a business?
different perspectives also, local perspective, national perspective. Siyempre, sa baba, iniisip mo, kabuhayan, development. Sa taas naman, you're looking out
preservation.
for preservation.
Exactly.
So how do you balance all those? Well,
That
it's
is
a full debate.
That
Another
is a question na
episode.
hindi natin sure kung ano yung talagang sagot. Pero
They'll
hopefully, in
just have
another episode, we'll find out.
You'll just have to keep watching.
But that's it for the big story tonight.
Count your calories in Quezon City. We are One News, all sides, all the time.
Thanks for tuning in. Have a good night.